In today's note, we're going to be looking at food chains, food webs, and food pyramids. So basically, we're looking at how to organize some of the ecological relationships that we may come across. So just some definitions. We have a food chain, and a food chain is an interaction that connects organisms based on the order in which they feed on one another. So basically, it's just showing who eats who in the ecosystem. And as we look at a food chain, the energy is continuously lost from all levels of the food chain. So as we move from one link or one stage in the chain to the next, we're losing energy, or we're losing the amount of energy available. And a food web is a group of chains from one community or ecosystem that are connected together. So basically, a food chain is just one strand, and a food web is all these strands connected together. They're highly complex as consumers feed on many species. So whether it's an organism eating plants or an organism eating other organisms, they're highly complex because things in the wild or organisms they don't just eat one type of species, right? They feed on a variety. So there's multiple food chains out there, which makes this more complex. And it's a useful tool to figure out what may happen when species are removed from or added to an ecosystem. So if we're looking at a food chain and we just want to see, okay, what happens if we remove a species or we add a species, it's kind of straightforward because it either adds a link to the chain or it just stops the chain completely. If we're looking at a food web, it's more useful because we can trace back, or whether we're adding something in or removing something, we can kind of trace back all the connections to see what could be affected and then branch off and continue back from there. And finally, a trophic level. A trophic level is a feeding level of one or more organisms in a food chain or web. So again, we'll look at some examples of what we mean by trophic levels, but basically it's a level, one type of organism based on how it's feeding. So we're going to look at a food web versus food chain. So for a food chain, we're going to start off with nuts. And a squirrel can eat nuts, and then a weasel can eat squirrels, and then a bear can feed on weasels. So this is an example of a food chain. It's straightforward. It's based on who eats who, right? The nuts are eaten by the squirrel, which is eaten by the weasel, which is eaten by the bear. Remembering for the energy, the amount of energy available in nuts is lower than that or is higher than that in squirrels, and then squirrels is higher than in the weasels, and weasels are higher than the bears. So that's just an example of a standard food chain. If we add in something like berries change this food chain because berries can be eaten by bears. So bears can eat weasels or berries, but they're two different chains, so we're adding that in there. And berries can also be eaten by squirrels. So squirrels can eat nuts or berries, and the bears can eat the weasels or the berries. So we've added something else in there. We've added multiple chains to our one chain. So now we have what's considered a food web. So this is now just a little bit more complicated because we've added another organism in there. But again, it's still a simplified version. So now we're at a food web. So again, the food web is just a combination of food chains. Some definitions. So these are kind of looking at the trophic levels. So we have producers, and producers are basically plants that carry out photosynthesis. So these are any organisms that are plant life that create their own food and nutrients by using the sunlight through photosynthesis. Herbivores are an organism that consumes only plant material. So basically they only consume producers. Carnivore is an organism that eats other species of animals, and an omnivore is an animal that consumes other species of animals and plant materials. So again, producers are plants, herbivores only eat plants, carnivores only eat other animals, and omnivores eat both animals and plants. So just some examples, right? Producer is basically any plant life, herbivore could be elephants, carnivore would be lions, and an omnivore would be something like a bear. Food web, again, so definition. So we just, again, looking at more different trophic levels or in definitions. So we have decomposers. So decomposers are things such as various bacteria and fungi that break down dead materials and animal waste, and they extract the remaining nutrients. So any of the nutrients that aren't absorbed or aren't taken in by the other organisms that eat whatever it happens to be, the material or the animal waste, the decomposers extract whatever nutrients are left over. Scavengers are consumers that feed on the body of large dead animals, so they don't actually partake in the actual killing of the animal or the hunting of it. They more or less let someone else do that, and then they worry about just picking at the scraps, so to speak. And a parasite is an animal or plant that lives in or on another from which it obtains nourishment. So these are things, animals or plants that live in, again, they latch on in some shape or form, and they obtain nourishment from the organism it latches onto. So an example of decomposer, we have things like mushroom or fungi. Scavengers, we can see vultures, so obviously they didn't take down what looks to be like a large animal. Another animal did that, and they're just kind of picking at the scraps. And for a parasite, we see here an ant, and we see things growing out of the ant. So this is actually a parasite that gets into the ant and kind of takes it over and feeds off of it and causes it to actually walk or perch itself on a high spot where it eventually dies. And then these tendrils or branches grow out of the ant and then release their spores and then infect other ants. So it's actually a term, if you Google zombie ants, this is something that comes up because technically it's the fungi that's taking over the ant. Ecological pyramids. So we've looked at chains, webs. Pyramids are basically a display of relationships between the trophic levels in an ecosystem. So this is only going to show the trophic levels and all the organisms that can exist within that. So again, the way it kind of generally works, we have our producers at the bottom, which is the largest part. Then we have our primary consumers, secondary consumers, and tertiary consumers. So basically the primary consumers are the ones that consume the producers or the plant life, so generally herbivores. Secondary consumers are anything that consume the primary consumers, and the tertiary consumers consume the secondary consumers. So again, you can think of it as a generalized food chain for an entire ecosystem. So we can just see some examples here. Bring up laser pointer. So we can see three different ones. So we're looking here. This is generally looking at energy. So here 100% of the energy is found in primary producers. So in plants, you're going to have 100% of the energy. In primary consumers, so herbivores, there's 10% of the energy can be found there. In secondary consumers, there's 1%. And if you're a third level or tertiary consumer, there's about 0.1% of the overall energy can be found there. Right. And then we see here, parasites and decomposers feed at each level. So at all levels, parasites and decomposers can be found, whether it's on decaying plant matter or in animal waste or on like rotting animal carcasses, stuff like that. So parasites and decomposers can be found at all levels. This next one is looking at biomass, so how much biomass there is. So primary producers, again, there's a lot of biomass found, and then it decreases as you go up the level. And finally, same with the population size. So primary producers, there's lots of different plant life. There's lots of different, the population size of them is drastically higher than any of the other ones. Primary consumers, so you're looking at kind of like your herbivores. So there's still lots of those, but not nearly the same amount as the primary producers. And then it decreases as you go up the food chain, right? So basically saying that in terms of foxes compared to, say, owls and snakes, and then squirrels and rats and mice, there's fewer foxes than any of those, and definitely fewer foxes than compared to plant life. And the reason for that is based on the amount of energy available. right? There's lots of energy available in the primary producers, so it makes sense that primary consumers or herbivores, there's plenty of those because there's lots of energy that can be found in the plant life. But because the energy decreases as you go up the pyramid, there are fewer and fewer organisms at the higher levels because there's not that much energy available out there, right? You think of the foxes, there can only be so many foxes because they require a large amount of organisms to eat to gain enough energy to be able to survive, right? So the less energy that's available means that there's going to be less organisms available to acquire that energy. And then we'll look at things similar to that later when we look at a gizmo or a investigation. So for homework, you can try, don't worry about doing the try this on page 45 because you won't have some of the materials, but you can try working through the questions on page 47. Again, we're just looking at basically a general understanding of what a food web, a food chain, and a food pyramid look like and what they represent, and the kind of the definitions of each organism or trophic level that you may find.